Uh, Thank you. Do you have my slides?
We do, sir.
Okay. I have been a distant admirer or a fan of CCMB for decades. You may not know that no, before your times. I was fascinated to listen to your research work, and I'm particularly interested in the sewage surveillance for the reason that I'm an ardent advocate of eradication of SARS coronavirus. Eradication, like polio or smallpox. And if you ever reach that point of decision and action, then sewage surveillance will be an invaluable tool for surveillance, because we will need that if you are moving towards eradication. Thank you. So Dr. Madhu Nala, Dr. Vinay Nandakuri, Dr. Rakesh Mishra, Dr. Srinath Reddy, and my dear colleagues, I have chosen a topic like a spotlight on India's health management capability thrown by the pandemic. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next. On June 30 this year, the Supreme Court directed the National Disaster Management Authority to recommend. Can you leave it on the display? Yes, thank you. Recommend guidelines for ex gratia assistance on account of loss of life to the family members of the person who died due to COVID, as mandated under the DMA Act, the Disaster Management Act, and to issue simplified guidelines for issuance of death certificate or official document stating the exact cause of death due to COVID-19 to the family members of the deceased who died due to COVID-19. And today was the day given to the government to respond to these two issues. Next slide. So how was the National Disaster Management Agency involved? The government of India notified COVID-19 as a disaster in order to exercise powers under the Disaster Management Act 2005 via a letter dated 14/3/2020. In the modified list of items, the government of India has withdrawn the clause of ex gratia compensation, but the Supreme Court said that withdrawal has resulted in an anomaly which has no justification. So compensation is to be made effective. Next slide. My main question will be, why was NDMA involved? That's a very interesting question. Scientific medicine, as we all know, has two arms of health management, managing health, namely health protection and health restoration. Health protection is prevention of diseases, mitigation of determinants, and health promotion. These are functions of a health protection agency, otherwise called public health. Health restoration or health maintenance, some people would say, are after people fall ill, diagnose and treat diseases. That's the function of the healthcare system, as we all know. Epidemic control is a job of public health, and the spotlight is on the vacant spot of the Department of Public Health, which our Ministry of Health and Family Welfare do not have. the elephant is missing. And for the first time in the 73 years of our independence in 2020, India felt the dire need of public health, but its absence when the COVID-19 pandemic loomed large as an impending crisis with death and economic devastation in its path. Hence, reliance was made on NDMA because NDMA is directly under central government with reach all over the country, which if a public health department have been there, that also would have such national reach. Next slide. So suddenly, the cause of death issue became important. It has a legal implication. Cause of death, we think in terms of a medical issue. Is cause of death unimportant except under this legal issue? If cause of death is unimportant, numbers of death and case fatality rate, etc., are also unimportant. Is correct cause of death important only to scientific medicine? The media noted the mismatch between the gross scenes in burial grounds and crematoria, rivers, etc., and the undercounting of deaths. What was the evidence? One, excess deaths over civil registration. Second, you could calculate the expected deaths applying known case fatality rates in other countries. So epidemiologists and biostatisticians, demographers began collecting some data. Next slide. The Harvard Center for Global Development, Brown University, which I say HCBU, and the Hindu data team. There are many others. I'm just quoting these two that were handily available to me. The HCBU with 3 methods estimated a range of 3.4 million to 4.9 million deaths due to COVID. The Hindu estimate was 3.3 million. The official figure was 0.42 million. Remember, the global reported total is about 4.3 million. And India's death is almost equal to the recorded or reported global volume. Now, why does public health require accurate cause of death and numbers and rates and statistics? I'm not going into that here. Please think about that. Next slide. When and where did COVID-19 epidemic begin in India? The ICMR first Zero Survey report has the following statement. We estimated, the authors, a cumulative 6.46 million infections by May 3, 2020. On May 3, 2020, officially we had 42,505 infections recorded, with 1,395 deaths. That is a crude death rate of 3.28%. Now, RT-PCR or rapid antigen test positive persons are followed up until their files are closed, recovery or death. So the diagnosis due to COVID is a is the most reliable or valid endpoint. Now we have a problem. By May 3, there were an undetected 6.427 million at the rate of 3.28 pro rata at 209 2,94,908 deaths that we have missed in our recording system. So we had a massive nationwide epidemic of acute respiratory distress syndrome, which was missed by the healthcare system. So why did that happen? Because there is no emphasis on cause of death certification by anyone, and there is no collection method of linking the civil registration deaths with cause of death into the health management system. That is a glaring deficiency in India. Next slide. So when and where did the 6.4 million epidemic begin in India? If you think back, 3rd May to 3rd April to 3rd March, about 9 weeks. 3rd March, we knew 3 virus importations had happened in Kerala with no secondary spread due to effective isolation. So the 6.46 million did not grow from Kerala. It grew from elsewhere. Using roughly a doubling time of 1 week, 9 weeks earlier, 25,147 importations by 3rd March, we had probably totally missed. Why? Because we do not have a proper public health disease surveillance system. So even though there were this massive numbers of a new disease, ARDS, and death with diagnosis with severe hypoxemia and ARDS, we missed that because we don't have an active real-time all disease covering disease surveillance system. We have other systems, but they do not provide us this kind of real-time information. Next slide. We think disease surveillance is any information gathering on any disease, used mainly for statistics, not for health management, because we get the information quite late. It's not real time. This is what India has practiced all along, except for one disease, polio. The global definition is it's a real time, mandatory reporting by all physicians of all cases of notified diseases to public health officers, meant mainly for disease control and for monitoring the control trajectory of different diseases and to detect any unexpected health problems in anywhere in the country. And this kind of surveillance requires a Department of Public Health, because the reports are to public health officers who are then supposed to take action. Any disease of concern with diagnosis not fitting with known prevalent diseases must be reported. That's how new diseases are detected. Unclassifiable cause of death would have been noticed if we had a good surveillance system. COVID had some new features: hypoxemia, anosmia, bilateral all-lobe pneumonia, ARDS, etc. And if you look for influenza virus infection, you wouldn't find it. If there was a surveillance system, it would have caught it as an unclassified disease, triggering public health department disease detective investigation. Next slide. So cause of death is part of disease surveillance. Disease surveillance has limited disease spectrum, mostly or exclusively communicable diseases, selected notified communicable diseases, maybe 20 in number. Death certificate covers all communicable diseases not on the list and non-communicable diseases. Both are required by public health. In USA, the cause of death form, it's called the blue form, is designed by CDC. For healthcare, a patient dies, the cause of death is of academic interest. It involves one individual, one instance, and to check whether the diagnosis pre-death made by the healthcare system was correct or not. So it's of an academic value of one individual at a time. For civil registration, the question is it natural or unnatural? For public health, cause of death is vital because that impinges on the overall picture of disease distribution in the country. Next slide. Next slide, please. Can you have the next slide, please?
Yeah, I think there is a lag. We'll check, sir, quickly.
This is the problem of getting stuck with slides for your sequence of talk.
Once again, we'll try to put it here.
Yeah. So I have illustrated three issues, three problems of not having an effective functional public health department in our Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. For which reason the government had to assign the task of COVID management, epidemic management to NDMA. Because we don't have public health, we missed a new disease entering into the country, and deaths for far too long did not take serious note of the magnitude. And because of the low numbers, where is the 42,000 and where is 6.46 million, that appreciation, lack of appreciation of the magnitude, the numbers looked low, and that gave some degree of overconfidence that the epidemic is under control. India is not getting affected like other countries are. The third is, of course, all we now know about the gross discrepancy between civil registration and COVID deaths. Next slide. Our country had reached 3 trillion economy. Can we become a 5 trillion economy in the coming few years? We probably cannot. Why is public health not taken seriously. I have my own suspicion that in our cultural belief, health is not manageable by governance. Why? Because diseases are either due to individual choice, lifestyle. Therefore, internal imbalances of homeostasis, for which the ill individual is totally responsible, or due to influences not under human control. So culturally, public health claiming ability to manage what cannot be managed is a materialistic mirage. This is my assumption, conclusion, looking at the cultural milieu in which I live. So without public health, we will forever remain a developing country. The 5 trillion is a mirage. Next slide. Because we didn't have public health, the first defense against a pandemic, social vaccine, information education, communication, and behavior modification education, for which India was known during the AIDS epidemic during the mid-1980s. But nobody asked the AIDS control agency as to how do we do social vaccine. And even if we knew, there was no public health department to spread the social vaccine idea throughout the country. Secondly, the biologic vaccine was not actually planned by NDMA. After the 2 private companies got emergency use application, did we begin ordering vaccine, leading to shortages compared to requirements, as we all know, advanced purchase arrangements, early planning for volumes of vaccine, all these kind of things were a problem. And when there was vaccine hesitancy, there is no mechanism to educate the public vaccine safety, efficacy, and to counter hesitancy. All this actually requires a vibrant, functional public health system. Next slide. Most important lesson pandemic has taught us is that India urgently needs public health. If we must control TB, for example, the single most important communicable disease, annual prevalence according to WHO 70 million, annual loss 70 million. These cases are mostly in the age group in which you are working and producing, creating wealth. So if you simply calculate GDP per capita loss of 70 million people, it comes to rupees 7 billion or 700,000 crores. So TB cannot be controlled without universal primary health care and public health division in the government. Next slide. Furthermore, the pandemic has taught us once again that health and wealth are intimately intertwined. They are mutually creative and supportive. Health creates wealth, wealth creates health. Wealth creation is political language. Health management must also become political language. So India has miles to go before we can actually become a country that is able to control existing diseases like TB and newcomers like the pandemic. And so before the next pandemic comes, we must establish an effective public health division in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob John. I think the message is loud and clear on the necessity of a system like public health with us. Thank you very much for your talk. And I just request if there are any questions from the listeners, I would appreciate at this time.
Any questions from any questions from the participants? Please, maybe you can unmute and speak. One question we can take.
Maybe we should wait until all speakers have their presentations and then come to a discussion. Otherwise, if you open it now, you will not know when to close it.
Great. Yeah. Sure, sir. Yeah. I think
we have few questions, all right, but they are kind of their answers will be the later talks, I guess, because the nature of the questions are such. So I request the persons who posted the questions to hang on.
Yeah, I think Madhu got stuck. Maybe some internet issues, but yeah, I think these questions probably, I think as Dr. Jacob mentioned, I think we can take the questions at the end of the session, probably with all the speakers when they finish their sessions. And now, and before Madhu comes, thank you, Dr. Jacob, for your wonderful stats and numbers. Pretty impressive numbers. Anyway, so our next speaker now today, I think that's on COVID-19 diagnostics. So I request Dr. Lalit. I think Dr. Modi is joining.
Yep, I'm here, Ramji.
One second, just wait, Lalit. Madhu is back, I guess. So.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Lalit is a kind of long-time colleague and has been involved in the diagnostics space for last more than a year, and he is spearheading the program called Index as resources and ability to make diagnostics. I think it's a very, very important thing, because in the early part of the pandemic, we have seen the shortfall of kits, and that resulted in a lot of issues. And at that point of time, Lalit was heading a project on organization, and I'm sure he has a lot of data to share, information to share on the present scenario of the ability of India in meeting these diagnostic challenges as we have seen for this current pandemic. Lalit, thank you very much for being with.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me here. I hope all of you can hear me, and it's really a privilege to be part of such a stellar group of speakers. And from the aspect of lessons learned, and that's why I say local and very highly vocal kind of lessons learned. Some of them are very loud lessons, but it's seen from a purely commercial point of view for the diagnostics business and the diagnostic industry of India, seen from purely that perspective, and seen from the perspective of how we can use adversity to kind of lay some stepping stones for future growth, seen from just those two aspects. Obviously, what we're going through is a huge historic human tragedy, but just seen from these two aspects, there are multiple lessons to be learned and multiple pathways for growth as we go forward. And CCAMP Index, like Dr. Madhu mentioned, was formed at the very initial stages. We've been amply supported both by DBT. We have been working in conjunction with the National Biomedical Resources Indigenization Consortium, NBRIC, and we've been funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So broadly, and just so that you know, all along my slides, anything that is highlighted in blue is a lesson. So you can see my slides, you know where the lessons are. Indigenization of diagnostics as a project, and very briefly about the project, was initiated in the beginning of June last year. July 1st is when we flagged off. An extremely lean team, close to about 20 people working in the team, close to about 100 projects completed. And we work on 4 aspects of what we think is indigenization. Primary thing is indigenization itself, on quality, on scale up, and on commercialization. We are right now a consortium of about close to 150 MSMEs, small companies, large companies, and about 350 diagnostics products, both direct diagnostic kits as well as reagents, lotions, potions that go into making diagnostic kits. We are obviously not working alone. We are aided by 8 centers of excellence for quality, for clinical, for chemistry, biologics. Our antigen antibody center of excellence is at CCMB and is headed by Dr. Madhu himself. We have a center of excellence for scale up, analytics, and informatics, because those are the 8 aspects we think that all diagnostics companies deal with. And so those are the 8 areas in which we are extending our helping hand to companies which are indigenous producers of diagnostics in India. All of this is brought together by what you see at the bottom of the slide, a marketplace. And the marketplace is actually a virtual marketplace that has been built with the help of Tata Consultancy Services, TCS. And they've built this beautiful portal for us where all of these COEs, these companies, these products, our teams, all of them merge together. There's a vital exchange of both information, and a lot of project management happens on the marketplace. Even buying and selling is beginning to happen on the marketplace. That's the large project, and I would gladly answer any questions that you have on the index project itself. But my key contribution today would be on lessons learned. So when we say, and for a long time, I thought, I always knew that molecular biology 101. If you had a course in molecular biology, RT-PCR would be 101. It would be very basic. After PCR, you would run RT-PCR. But I never thought that I'd see the day when common men and women in the world, on the street, would keep saying RT-PCR. But that's what it's come to. So in that sense, when we started looking at indigenization and looking at indigenization of reagents from India, there's a lot of learning and a lot of growing that needs to happen. One of the first things that we learned is that, simple things like, do we make enzymes? Do we make DNTPs? Do we have primers and probes? Do we have master mixes? Very simple questions to ask from an indigenization perspective. In the last 50 years, and I remember, and Dr. Jacob mentioned that he's been a fan of CCMB. I was there when CCMB got inaugurated, when the road got constructed to CCMB from Taranaka. That's when I was there, but as a kid, of course. But what I'm saying is that from that day to today, we've been talking about biotechnology so much, but simple things like DNTPs, there is not a single manufacturer of DNTPs in India as of last year. Obviously things are changing. We learned that. In terms of enzymes, in terms of primers and probes, in terms of master mixes, simple things that we thought were necessary. Are there people capable of doing it? Yes, there were people capable of doing it, but did they have the capacity? In a lot of cases with respect to enzymes, did they have the intellectual property? And did they understand the requirements of compliance, which is the difference between having regular enzymes versus diagnostic grade enzymes? And did they have the capacity to manufacture at scale with the consistency that's required of a diagnostic kit? Those are serious lessons that needed to be learned. So right now we've learned in a very hard way a lot of companies, and I'm not saying that all companies are the same. Like I said, there's startups, and then there is large companies like Syngene or Tata Medical Diagnostics which have come into this space. So there's a huge range of companies here. But we have learned the very hard way that there is science, which a lot of people here talk about and know, and then there is regulatory science. Regulatory science is a whole different game altogether. When it comes to scale, when it comes to developing independent intellectual property, when it comes to making diagnostic grade reagents, and when it comes to developing small labs or small companies into these manufacturing giants, I think great lessons have been learned. I know that I'm being followed by one of the top manufacturers in India. I mean, Shishir is here and he will talk about that, I'm sure. But the ethos, the very essence of becoming a manufacturing company has grown so much in the last 18 months, like it has never before grown in India. So that is one thing that we have definitely learned. I mean, I just go through small things that we did and big lessons learned. We were looking at making primers and probes. So we looked at, can we make amidites in India? And the big lesson learned here, and I have the lesson underlined in blue, and I want to shout out this lesson from rooftops to everyone, is that if it's good for the world, it should be good for India. And why am I saying this? Because we realized we had a couple of companies in India that were manufacturing amidites, which would then go on to be used in manufacture of primers and probes, which would then be used in diagnostic kits across the board for all kinds of infectious diseases. But the amidites that were being made in India were actually being shipped worldwide. Worldwide, they were being shipped. Global manufacturers, global companies, like, I mean, I don't want to name the companies, but global companies from which everyone would buy amidites were actually getting them custom manufactured from these manufacturers, repackaging them and selling them back to us at an exorbitantly higher price. So just getting into that mode of searching and finding those gems of companies in India, which are actually already serving the world, would be a great thing for all of us to do. And so that's the first lesson we learned. If it's great for the world, it should be good for India too. And we found those companies, we brought them out, and today we have a huge cost reduction in amidites. The other lesson learned, and again from a seriously lesson point of view, making primers and probes. Uh, we had companies, and we have a long list of companies for a long time that have made primers and probes in India. These primers and probes would generally be supplied to a lot of DBT institutions, ICMR institutions, CSIR institutions. On a daily basis, people would do PCRs or RT-PCRs or do sequencing. But what this pandemic has done is that it has quickly converted some of these companies into large-scale manufacturers. So now these companies that were making 50 nanomole scale oligos on a daily basis can now make 10 micromolar, 50 micromolar, even 100 or 200 micromolar scale oligos. And I mean, nano to micro is like close to about 50,000, 20,000 times higher scale manufacture is possible from the same companies. Today, we have companies that are able to manufacture at scale, but it's not just about scale, it's also about the turnaround time. It would take about 4 weeks for you to get primers from a global company. Today, within 7 days, you can get it from a local company and it's the same quality. So one of the things that we've learned is that now we can manufacture at scale. Companies have learned to scale up and scale fast. When it comes to simple things like master mixes in real-time PCR, what we learned is that we need more companies. We need more and more entrepreneurship. There are great companies, and I know success stories that you've seen of companies like MyLab, of Huwell, Jinai, which is an old company. Some of these companies that are making strides in India right now, I mean, they're doing great, and all good luck to them. But we need more and more companies that manufacture basic building blocks, molecular biology components, and we need 1,000 diagnostic companies to deal with this kind of a pandemic. And if we have enough companies, there is huge potential for export across the world, and that's the reason we need it. For example, in master mixes, we barely have about 5 master mixes that are working in India right now. People are busy buying from multinationals, whereas actually the cost of master mixes came down from about 125, 150 rupees to about 15 rupees. And I know for a fact that we can have a 5 rupee master mix in no time. Which also is another lesson learned, that we were probably paying way too much to the multinational companies for simple ingredients that we could make on our own with global quality. And that's something that we learned during the last few months. The other thing that we learned is that, and I say it with utmost respect, I mean, I work for a program called Indigenization of Diagnostics. I have great respect for indigenization, Make in India. But one of the things is that if you see this seal, this emblem, this symbol on a product, it's not necessarily made in India. I mean, I think that we have to have much stronger, much stricter ways to define, measure, reward, and then eventually go ahead and buy indigenous products. We have to evolve a clear definition, specifically when it comes to pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, medical devices, and healthcare products. I think we have to evolve a very clear definition of what we recognize as indigenous, because a lot of companies that call themselves indigenous are repackagers, refillers. They just get it in bulk and refill it. Wait, that was what was noticed in the beginning, but it's not just refilling and repackaging anymore. We have seen cases where the refilling, the aliquoting into the tubes also happens in China. We have seen cases where instructions for use in Hindi are printed in China. So it is entirely possible that this symbol that you see that says Make in India is actually printed in China. And that is something that is very disturbing. I think we need to have a better way to define, measure, reward. And we have to have this attitude to go out and buy truly indigenous products. That's a true lesson that we have to learn. The other lesson that we really have to learn, and this is probably the last one before I kind of show you a little bit of data on where we are, we have to stay ahead. So in terms of staying ahead, this is something we really have to we have to start to see what is ahead. Right now, we have enough diagnostic kits, but we need kits that can bring speed to the table. We need instant kits, maybe 10-minute kits. We need to do assurance testing for events, or assurance testing for institutions, schools, offices, so that we can open them up. People are lining up outside the office. Can we quickly do a test and check them in or check them out? But can we do that with speed? That's one thing. The other thing where we need support is in terms of testing people's immunity, personalized testing. Dr. Jacob talked about seropositivity testing, and Dr. Nandikuri mentioned how we are looking at populations and epidemiology as a whole. But more personalized antibody tests are important, because every single person needs to know when if he needs to get a booster shot. We are hearing cases about where one vaccine doesn't work for a person, but probably works for another person. In which case, with an increased menu of vaccines available, is it possible for people to test themselves and find out which is the best vaccine suited for them? Those are the kind of tests that we need to start to think about. Other diagnostics are extremely important. The Delta Plus variant is not as long lasting as the previous variants. It's a shorter kind of a hit on the human body. So if you have to wait for the third day to go in and give you a test, and if you have to wait for the fifth or the sixth day to get your results, you're not getting your results in time. So one of the things that you need is speed, but the other thing you need is all the other ancillary diagnostics. If you think that we were extremely dependent on foreign supplies for COVID, you will just have to see the numbers on inflammatory testing, or some of the other pathology testing that we do. We are so dependent on imports that we really have to ramp up those imports. It will also help us ramp up those reagents for indigenization. But you'll also notice that with increased pathological testing, we can actually evolve better triaging techniques so that patients can be treated better. The last thing that I think some of the diagnostic companies need to look at is look at novel diagnostics, but diagnostics that will help determine what the best therapy for the patient is. That kind of companion diagnostics, something that will not just tell people if they're positive or negative, because we've had a lot of that testing, but now start to tell people you're positive, and given this test, this is the best therapy for you. I think we need to get companion diagnostics happening, or estimation of oxygen need, how severe is the disease going to be. Some things like that is what I hope we will start to look at. That attitude to stay ahead and look forward is what something that I hope everyone would learn. The other thing that I would ask is that one of the most important thing is raise your hand, seek help and support. Uh, Rockefeller Foundation funded the CCAMP Index program. We went in and we did multiple projects. We've done about 100 projects so far for so many companies. And yet, when I call a company and tell them we have this, we have this program, we're out to help you, we are here for Atmanirbhar diagnostics, still there is doubt in people's minds, in companies' minds. They're like, why are you doing this? And why is it free? What do you expect from us? We are here to help. These programs exist so that you can quickly come in, seek help, get the support you need, and launch your products and take them across the country, make them global if need be. So please seek help and please seek support. A quick view of where we are, and this is very rough estimates, but this is what it is. We are doing approximately 2 million tests a day today in India. Out of these 2 million tests, close to about 830,000, close to about 830 to 850,000 are RT-PCR tests. The remaining are rapid tests as of now. Out of these, about and the lowest of the curve, the one in grayscale, shows you where the indigenous tests are. The contribution of indigenous tests, specifically in the RT-PCR space, is growing and is growing like mad. Now, does this mean that we can, out of the 830,000 RT-PCR tests that we are doing per day, is it that indigenous companies are only able to produce 664,000? No. The capacity for manufacture is much higher. We can manufacture much more than even 830,000. So if you look at our capacities are such that we can even produce 1 million tests per day. And I mean, when Shishir comes on later on from Huwell, he will tell you that he alone probably wants to manufacture and can manufacture that much. Our capacities are humongous. So if these companies are allowed to export, we can gain complete, total 100% self-sufficiency, self-reliance in diagnostic testing, both from the rapid testing as well as RT-PCR side, and we can also export. This is an important thing to learn, is that our capacities have been growing, hugely growing, and we are headed for a situation where India is the pharma supplier to the world. India is the biopharma supplier to the world. India is the vaccine supplier to the world. We have a very good shot at making India the diagnostics supplier to the world. And I think that is the lesson that we've learned, of being optimistic about where at least the diagnostic business will go. This is, like I said, a human tragedy. It's a very big tragedy that's happening, that's unfolding, and hopefully we are getting some control of it. But the most important thing is the diagnostics businesses in India have woken up and have taken up the challenge and are meeting the challenge head on. They're meeting the challenge head on and making us self-reliant in the country, but also taking Indian diagnostics global. That is what is happening right now. And I want you all to take a pause and recognize the effort that the diagnostics manufacturers in the country are making. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Dr. Madhu.
Thank you, Lalit, for the presentation on the status of diagnostics, especially the RT-PCR. It's a commendable effort from Index side to put these things together and encourage people to participate and then support them and then test them and then help them in making a product and validate it so that it can be marketed. I think this is something that would have been great if we had it a year ago, but I think we are not. We are still in the COVID times, and I think we do require these tests continuous basis. And the fact that the RT-PCR is a generic technique and it can be used for many other diseases and much more accurately than other tests that are prevalent now. I think it will have a long haul as a routine diagnostics for various diseases, including cancer. I think that's a tremendous, achievement from your side and your team. And thank you very much for your time and giving your viewpoint and the achievements of your place. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have few questions.
Please.
We have few questions on this, but I think we will take them up as we go along.
Sure.
And as I said earlier, I think some of these questions would be answered as we go on. And then we have the next speaker, Dr. Srinath Reddy. Dr. Srinath Reddy, as probably everyone knows, is president of Public Health Institute, and he was formerly the head of cardiology at AIIMS, and he has a very distinguished career
Are you able to hear?
No, we can't hear.
We can't hear. So I mean, am I the alone not hearing? So Madhu may be coming back. Just a second.
Madhu, you go to
If I
Ramji's
can
computer.
say,
That is
can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Recording in progress.
I'm sorry, I think the internet is a bit unstable. Just let me say it again. I request Dr. Srinath Reddy to give his talk. And as I said earlier, Dr. Srinath Reddy is president of Public Health Institute, and he was head of the cardiology at AIIMS, and he has a very distinguished career in the area of cardiology across the globe with various positions. And he has been a very prominent spokesperson on the issues related to COVID. And we are very happy to have him, sir. I request you to give your talk now.
Thank you very much for this. Is it echoing? Okay, now it's better. Thank you very much for this very gracious invitation to join this very distinguished panel on a subject of great, not only in terms of scientific interest, but in terms of public health and economic import. I completely agree with Professor Jacob John that one of the major lessons of this particular pandemic has been that public health systems need to be greatly strengthened, both in terms of surveillance and in terms of timely response in a very integrated fashion across the country. I also agree with him that public health failures will be disastrous for the economy. In fact, if we aspire to be a rapidly developing economy, we must recognize, like other countries in the world too must recognize, that the economy will keep slipping on the banana skins of public health failure unless we consistently strengthen and invest in public health systems. The only place where I'll probably differ with Professor Jacob John is in his conviction that COVID-19 can be completely eradicated. And perhaps towards the end of my talk, I'll explain why I have a different view. But starting on the questions of learnings from COVID, well, let's start with the origins. They are still shrouded in controversy. So I'll not get into the whole area of whether it's a lab leak or whether it is a completely zoonotic transfer from animal to humans. The fact that it is zoonotic, I think, is fairly certain because it was isolated from the bats in the caves near Wuhan. And if it underwent subsequent transformation, we do not know. But the fact that many of these viruses do travel in a zoonotic fashion from animal to humans is abundantly clear. And it is the lack of open communication which can spawn a number of public health harming conspiracy theories. And that's my lesson number one. It is because of the curtain drawn over the nature of work being done in the Wuhan laboratory that, or even the funding from the United States, of what is called the gain of function research, that we have seen how a number of conspiracy theories have been spawned, and they've hurt public health in a great way. But it's also true that the gain of function research itself is dangerous if it was indeed being attempted on the scale that has been described in some of the alarmist reports. Its moral moorings are shaky. And before we start playing Frankenstein in creating dangerous pathogenic forms, I think there is a lesson to be learned here. But coming to the transmission dynamics, it is very clear that most of the zoonotic infections that have occurred in the past 60 years, in terms of animal to human transmission, actually dominate the new infectious disease outbreaks globally. About 2/3 of all infections in terms of new outbreaks have been zoonotic. Not because animals have become suddenly malevolent towards human beings, but because we have laid conveyor belts for their transfer from wildlife, animals and birds into veterinary populations or into human populations directly, or from animal populations to human populations through captive bred animal populations, extensive deforestation because of urban growth unplanned, and so on, and food and agricultural systems also encroaching on forestry. And that is a lesson, again, we need to learn, that unless we restore ecological balance to our developmental paradigms, we are bound to have more and more zoonotic pandemics. The question of transmission from human to human has been an area of considerable controversy over the first part of the pandemic, when the initial conclusion was that it was entirely a droplet transmission. When some of the environmental scientists raised the question of whether it's an aerosol transmission, the WHO and the CDC dismissed that suggestion totally out of hand. Indeed, I was reminded of what A.J. Cronin wrote, a physician novelist of the last century, indeed of the first half of the last century, whose notable books, Citadel and Adventures in Two Worlds, were partly autobiographical, and they actually were converted also into a Hindi film called Tere Mere Sapne. But there, Cronin, who works in the coalfields of Wales, appears for the MRCP examination in London and is dismissed out of hand by a Harley Street physician who thinks of this man as coming from the absolutely unsophisticated coalfields. Whereas there is a far more sympathetic examiner who examines him. But finally, after having been impressed by Cronin, asks him, before you examine any patient, what is it that you say to yourself? And Cronin says, not to take anything for granted. And that is an answer that pleases the examiner. I would say, in this case, scientists have actually taken too many things for granted in the initial stage and dismissed the aerosol theory completely out of hand. And therefore, the lesson is that the skepticism of the scientific method, which is absolutely essential, that should not be translated into the arrogance of scientists. And we did see that. The WHO tweeted in capital letters, no less, last year, fact, COVID-19 is not airborne. And the correction was issued only on the 30th of April, 2021, a year after a number of environmental scientists had written that they had a fair amount of confidence that this was actually an aerosol spread. And the CDC corrected it only in May 2021. Now, this is because of an error which crept into literature, which said that anything above 5 microns in size is not airborne. Therefore, it has to be purely droplet spread. Whereas the original proponent, long time back in the 1940s and 50s, had actually described it as 100 microns, but there was a confusion when the discussion took place on tuberculosis, spread in tuberculosis. And therefore, it was felt only tuberculosis and measles are essentially airborne spread, and others are by droplet spread. And it has taken nearly 8 years for that fact to be registered, and more than 1.5 years for it to be corrected by WHO and CDC. So this led to experiential wisdom of the Southeast Asian countries and Asian countries, which they garnered from the SARS-1 epidemic, and where masks have become a part and parcel of their early response to the SARS-2 pandemic. And it was much, much later that masks were mandated as an important element of the public health response. Though we in India did do it fairly earlier, even before the WHO and the CDC adopted that. And we saw, because of the belief that it was purely droplet, the great emphasis on 6 feet or 2 meters distancing rule, which is fine from the point of view of droplet infections, which still are a channel of infection, and hand washing too. But the whole area of ventilation and even the masks were completely neglected in the initial stages of the pandemic. And that is where I believe a considerable amount of lessons need to be learned as to how we must respond with far greater alacrity. And it was not as though this evidence of aerial spread was not easily available. Atmospheric physicists, engineers, and researchers in second-hand smoke knew how aerosols travel from room to room. And therefore, in closed buildings, ill-ventilated spaces, they can be a great source of spread. Yet, we neglected it for a substantial period of the epidemic. Whereas the evidence had come in even earlier from cruise ships, Navy ships, restaurants, call centers, churches, and even choir rehearsals, where people who are not necessarily close to each other were infected because of the aerosol spread. And we know from air pollution science that particles of many sizes hang aloft, travel far, and can be inhaled. And this whole controversy of 5 microns or 100 microns controversy had to be resolved ultimately when the aerosol scientists had to hire a history researcher who went back into history and then found out that the confusion between 5 microns and 100 microns came about in a very unfortunate manner. But that again shows that we must have a sense of humility and, much more importantly, a far greater receptivity to multidisciplinarity. Unless we bring in multiple sciences together, we are likely to neglect evidence even when it is staring at us in the face. And therefore, we must recognize as a lesson that multidisciplinarity is a vital asset of science. But that also brings us to the question of what is evidence? Evidence required for public health or for clinical practice. We have had excellent results in terms of drug trials, in terms of vaccine trials, and last 1.5 years have been a great success story in that regard. However, in those areas, the randomized clinical trial is seen as the gold standard of evidence, but unfortunately elsewhere in public health, even the same canon of the randomized control trial has been sort of in a reflex manner transferred as the gold standard of evidence without recognizing that there is a huge amount of complexity that we have to deal with, which does not necessarily lend itself to randomized control trials. And that is why in the first place, masks got ignored. Indeed, we had the Royal Society of UK coming up with the conclusion about the aerosol spread in a review of the evidence on masks, recommending masks. Unfortunately, epidemiologists scoffed at it, saying that it was not sufficiently evidence-informed. Now, if that is the kind of problems that where we are neglecting that evidence that comes from laboratory studies, mathematical modeling, and policy studies, and actual real-life experience of various countries, then we are likely to be ignoring a lot of valuable evidence. So we do need evidence-based practice, but we also need practice-based evidence, which has to learn from what practice has happened and build evidence from that and test it out again. And therefore, that is absolutely important. But all of this comes in because we fail to recognize that we're dealing with complex adaptive systems all through. In fact, even the virus is a complex adaptive system. There is an excellent book on the virus being a complex adaptive system, published by Princeton by Ricardo Soleil and others in 2019. Even the virus is a complex adaptive system. And the health system is a complex adaptive system. The ecological system is a complex adaptive system. And when we are seeing multiple complex adaptive systems with non-linear causality, then if we adapt to only linear inference models, whether it is for causality or for treatment, then we are likely to be falling into a great deal of mistaken decision making. And therefore, bringing in the complexity science is absolutely important. Population-wide public health measures are typically iterative, locally grown, and path-dependent, ignoring the emergence, the phenomenon of emergence, which means that when multiple complex units interact with each other, the product is not a summation of those, but each subsequent step can be amplified by the preceding step. It is emergence, there is path dependency, there is non-linearity. All of these will have to be recognized, and unless epidemiology itself and public health itself does not grow out of the linear model of thinking as an automatic reflexive reaction and accommodate complexity science in its estimates and in its responses, we will still be falling short, even when we take non-communicable diseases for that matter. Now, we are treating this only as an infectious disease epidemic, but we also know that the most of the people who have actually had severe disease and have died are people with comorbidities, with non-communicable diseases. So we really can't tease out this, as it's been put in the Lancet, it's a syndemic. But there are multiple interactive phenomena that we need to understand. And while we do need clear-cut solutions, unless we learn to deal with complexity, and if we follow linear models of inferential deduction, then we are going to fall into incomplete solutions. And that is the lesson that I would like to really say is an important lesson from this whole pandemic, from the public health perspective and policy perspective. Then comes the question of waves. How did we have the waves and how did we deal with the waves? Now, in terms of the waves, the first wave, we did succeed well because we acted fast enough. When cases were still limited in number, we went into a prolonged lockdown. How it was managed is a different issue. We went into a prolonged lockdown, countrywide lockdown. There is excellent coordination between the center and the states. Travel was restricted even after the lockdown was lifted. By the time the masks started coming into play, and at least some of the public health advisories were reasonably well followed, travel was greatly restricted. Even the festival season of October, November 2020 was greatly muted. So when we actually did succeed, our success was we prevented the virus from going into the rural areas because we had restricted travel. We also gained our advantage from the fact that we had a much younger population, and even the transmission rates within rural areas are likely to be low. But by the time we came up to early January, we believed that we had acquired the nirvana of herd immunity. We had all kinds of experts telling us that herd immunity had arrived, and the politicians believed them, the industrialists wanted to believe them, and the people, of course, wanted to believe them because they wanted to return to life and normal. And we had all kinds of publications and models coming up saying that we are now going to have a second wave. And that led to a complete swing of the pendulum from lockdown to laxity, and that gave the virus a free rein as the variants started entering. By December, we knew, and by January, we acknowledged that the alpha variant was within us. By February, we knew, and by March, we acknowledged that the Delta variant was very much active in the country. So, given the fact that we now had more infectious variants and a super highway for them to travel because of the way in which we allowed super spreader events to take place, it was no surprise that the second wave came in. But the biggest mistake was allowing the virus to travel freely into rural areas, which might have been otherwise better protected. But a variety of elections, local bodies, assembly elections, religious festivals, gatherings, all of them ensured that the virus had an opportunity to infect even rural and remote areas. And therefore, the second wave, we've paid a penalty. But the big illusion was that we had herd immunity, and I'll come to that later. Now, what is herd immunity? Herd immunity depends upon a certain degree of herd immunity threshold. The initial estimate was that 60 to 70% of the people would have to become immune for the virus transmission to stop or be stalled substantially. But as the more infectious variants came in, the estimates got revised to 80%, now to 90%, as according to some of the estimates. Now, given these, we have seen that we have that the herd immunity threshold is falling short even of the ICMR National Sero Survey estimate of about 67%. But the most important thing that we must recognize is that the immunity that is shown, even in the Sero Survey, is not necessarily long-lasting. If antibodies are going to disappear in 3 to 6 months, and we do not know what the state of the cellular immunity, T-cell immunity is, we do not know how long a single exposure to the virus by way of a variable dose exposure in an infection, natural infection, is going to last. Secondly, we do not know whether the antibodies that have been detected in a Sero Survey are neutralizing antibodies or not, because their capacity to neutralize has not been tested. Therefore, you can't say that 67% of India is automatically immune by now. That would be a wrong estimate. And we know that because in Brazil, which has been devastated by the pandemic, we have seen in January a report from Manaus that despite 76% of the population having antibodies, the pandemic was still raging and the hospitals were crowded. Later on in April, we learned that in another province of Brazil, Serrana, where about 60% of the population had been vaccinated, between February and April, the deaths had come down by 95% and the infections had come down by 86%, suggesting again that vaccination gives you a much more standardized dose of viral exposure, and particularly if you have both a priming dose and a booster dose, your immunity is likely to be much better. But my most important concern about herd immunity being a misconception in the minds of people is that it is actually herd protection that is operating here. If a large number of people are immune, then they form a protective cordon to prevent the virus from being transmitted to the people who are not immune. But those people who are not immune among that particular population group, either because they have not been infected or they have not been vaccinated, if they travel outside of that community to another part of the city, another city, or another country where the virus is still in active circulation and only where 30% of the people have acquired immunity, these people are also very susceptible to infection. It is not that they have become not susceptible. And therefore, herd immunity is not a magic clock that you can carry with you from your herd to another herd. And unless that clarity is conveyed very clearly by public health experts and policymakers, people will again think that we are not going to have a third wave because we have already acquired herd immunity. I've already heard the government of Delhi making statements like that. But anyway, that is as far as the waves are concerned. Now, of course, we do have an opportunity by following both public health containment measures and speeding up vaccination to keep our third wave to a trickle rather than to a tidal wave. And that is what we must really aim to achieve. In terms of the epidemiology, the next thing comes to what measures do we have? Are we really grossly underestimating our cases? Are we grossly underestimating our deaths? Already Professor Jacob John has given you the statistics and the various conflicting estimates. But I would say we have major problems about all of them, of course. But whenever we compare, it is not the absolute numbers that must be compared. You have to adjust for the population size. The initial part of the pandemic, the comparison, whether made by Indians or whether made by international observers, was in terms of absolute numbers. I must say that I had written in the Financial Express that this is not correct, and also in the Hindustan Times, that it has to be a population adjusted. And if you do that, comparison between states of India and comparison between countries become much more meaningful, because you can't compare a small population size country to a large population size country. But that has happened much later as a general universal practice in India, but that's important. But coming to the R0, now that seems to be the magical number that everybody cites, saying that whether the pandemic is advancing or receding, and rightly so, to some extent. Is the virus actually infecting more people because we are giving it a more opportunity, or because it has acquired a variant which is more infectious? And it's good to measure that from that point of view. But we must also recognize the limitations, because the R0 says how many people is an infected person infecting, how many others are being infected by that person. But in a condition where the virus is resulting in a large number of asymptomatic persons, not everybody is symptomatic, and not everybody who is mildly symptomatic is getting tested. And not everybody who is symptomatic is being tested because the testing rates may be low. And not all testing is perfect. RT-PCR is much better than rapid antigen tests, and you may have false negative tests from rapid antigen tests. So how do you know for sure how many persons an infected person is actually infecting? Why are we so confident that our R0 numbers are so absolutely accurate, when we know that the same Delta variant in Britain, they are saying that it is infecting 7 to 8 people, and here we are calculating our R0 as 1.2. Therefore, I would say, yes, use the R0 as a trend tracker. Over a period of time, if the R0 increases, certainly it's a matter of concern. But to attach a religious significance to R0 when so many people are asymptomatically infected or are not even tested, I think would be a little over-enthusiastic. Coming to case fatality rate, I'm commenting on some of the measures because I believe it's important for science. Coming to case fatality rate, let us recognize that the case fatality rate has a numerator and a denominator. The numerator are the number of deaths. The denominator are the number of people infected. There is a great deal of uncertainty about the denominator. Unless you do a lot of testing, you will not know how many people have been really infected. But if you do a lot of testing, that means you are going to be landing up also with a number of negative tests, and you will also be having a number of people tested with more liberal criteria. If your tests are few, that means you're testing people with more strict criteria, which means your denominator gets inflated with a number of people who are not going to die. So the numerator will actually be reasonably accurate, whereas the denominator will expand hugely, and your case fatality rate appears to be very, very good. And that is exactly what President Trump did last year when he said that his mortality rates are much better than European countries and all other countries put together. That's because they were testing everybody, including a large number of asymptomatic people, and they were landing up with a huge denominator for the case fatality rate calculation. So it is important to calculate case fatality rate, but that's much better to calculate when your testing rates are accurate and you're using standardized testing methods. And same thing applies to test positivity rate. Now, again, we are swearing, ICMR says that anything about 10% of test positivity rate is a disaster. And WHO says that 5% or less test positivity rate is desirable. Of course, it's a very good measure, but then it depends upon how many people you are testing. If your testing rates are very low, then you may have a difficulty in finding out what your test positivity rate is in comparison to if your testing rate is very high. Because if you're testing a very large number of people very liberally with very liberal indications, you are bound to get many of them testing negative, but also some of them testing false positive. So test positivity rate also is affected by how many types of tests you're using and how many numbers you're testing. But again, these are trend indicators. They're not absolute. It's good to test them and do them for trends, but with standardized methodology with potential comparability. So we need good quality data. And this is something that has been fully emphasized. I completely agree. We need representative, accurate, and timely data. But we need data from multiple sources. For example, have data on our health system response, the ability of the health system to, or our supply chains, which have been talked about in the previous studies? We do not have, we have incomplete data on many things if we really want to plan a public health response. So we do need big data, and we need much better integration of that data. But again, the data will have to be gathered close to the ground, and there have to be different levels of complexity for the data. For ground level decision making, you require a simple set of data which can quickly be analyzed and fed back into the implementation and decision making loop at the ground level, local level, at the block level. At the district level, you require more amplified data. And at the state, capital, and central level, you require much larger data sets for resource allocation, for re-strategization, and for supervisory support, and so on. Therefore, what you need is data-driven, decentralized decision-making, preferably at the block level, or at least at the district level, not an over-centralized system. I completely agree with Dr. Jacob John that the more we centralize and the more we actually hand over the data management systems to non-public health agencies, we are likely to have failures. And closer we get to the ground, but also more connected we are across the public health system, the better it will be. And that's my lesson again. Now, for that, I believe also we need crowdsourcing of data. Now, primary care is going to be critical, but even crowdsourcing. How many people are reporting fevers going up? Are pharmacies reporting increasing sales of antipyretic drugs? I mean, there is so much that we can gather by way of our primary healthcare teams, supported by citizen volunteers capable of visiting house to house on a regular basis and finding out who has got cough, fever, breathlessness, and trying to get them tested. So primary care becomes absolutely important in public health. Without primary care, we have been focusing on hospitals and ventilators, then hospitals and oxygen systems. They are important. But how do you detect a person who has symptoms for early testing? How do you ensure contact tracing? Are people trained for contact tracing? Even in the United States, they've had failures because they did not employ enough people with contact tracing. And contact tracing in UK last year was a disaster. Only this year they've started correcting it. So where is our public health personnel for contact tracing? Then we need supervised and support to home care. Long COVID is becoming a problem of long-term sequelae. That requires primary care to take care of it. So our primary healthcare systems are absolutely critical, and that's one of the public health lessons. Of course, it needs to be well connected to secondary and tertiary care as well. So comprehensive, continuous, connected care is important. Even when you're talking about non-communicable diseases, how many of our people are lying with undetected diabetes and hypertension in rural areas and small towns? Even when you want to identify people with comorbidities for prioritized immunization, do you know all of them? We do not, because our health systems have not really done an assessment of people with non-communicable diseases and comorbidities. Leave aside prevent them, at least to identify them for prioritized vaccination. So a strong primary healthcare system is absolutely critical. Without that, we'll be tottering on weak legs if we only depend upon advanced care with ventilators. That is another very important lesson. So what we need is data-driven decentralized decision-making and people-partnered public health. Finally, are we going to eradicate this? What is the future of this pandemic? Professor Jacob John says that he believes in eradication. Unfortunately, only 2 diseases have been so far eradicated across the world. One is smallpox in human beings and rinderpest in cattle. Not even polio. Polio is still there in our neighborhood, in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Therefore, for respiratory viruses to be fully eradicated is going to be extremely difficult. So we may have to face up to the prospect of this virus living amongst us, but hopefully in a milder form with much better containment through vaccines and public health measures. We may have to believe in coexistence and co-evolution rather than complete eradication. And I'm not saying this entirely out of my own wisdom, but I'm borrowing from the wisdom of Joshua Lederberg. Joshua Lederberg received a Nobel Prize for microbial genetics in 1958 at a very young age. And in 2000, he wrote the history of infectious diseases in Science. In that, he says it is our wits versus their genes, but he cautions against use of militaristic language and says we cannot believe that we can eradicate everything. We may have to coexist, and he says replace the militaristic terminology with ecological terminology of how do we actually manage to coexist while controlling their pathogenic tendencies as well as possible. And therefore, vaccines are important, public health systems are important, and we must learn how to manage all of them while dealing with complexity science. And while certain linear models are very important and very useful in certain areas of science, in dealing with complex entities like viruses, health systems, and ecological systems, I think one of the major lessons of the pandemic is we ought to keep our minds much more open and deal with complexity as it comes along. Thank you.
Madhu?
Thank you, Dr. Srinath Reddy. I think the canvas was such a large one. And we really truly appreciate, because all these questions raised come across everybody's mind, that the statistics especially is so convenient for various agencies to use in a way they want. So it is quite an illuminating talk for us, and especially in looking at, I personally got attached to the statement on the habitat encroachments, and more or less this pandemic is also a kind of example of a self-inflicted disease, in the sense that our encroachments, replace or disturb the animal thing, and then zoonotic diseases become, as you said, a conveyor belts where the things can transmit much more easily. And I think that is what one of the other global initiative of One Health focuses on, is primarily on human, animal, and environmental balances, especially to prevent zoonotic diseases. I think the points were very well captured, and then I think we really appreciate the kind of level that you came from, especially the simple example of aerosol versus droplet. I think it's such a great example in telling how a small an issue like that can change the public suggestions and how one should be behave. I think it's a very fantastic example, and how we can make mistakes. I think science, as you say, I think people are confused, as everybody, including scientists. I think in this sudden pandemic, and I think people were right from the drugs to other things. I think there was a lot of tripping and standing up, and tripping and standing up. I think that's the lesson one we learned. And thank you very much for such a all-compassing and enlightening talk. We really, really appreciate you all. Thank you. And we have next the speaker from CCMB, Dr. Rakesh Mishra. Rakesh Mishra was kind of he initiated so many activities at CCMB and pushed all of us to be part of it. And I think his efforts were phenomenal in taking a lot of initiatives in COVID-related issues from CCMB, whether it is all kinds of surveillances, testing, training, variant genomics, everything. Probably we try to do our best given our little capacities as an institute, and culturing the virus and then using it for helping a lot of people to validate their products. We are all very busy and we are happy about it, more because we were able to help others to make some certain decisions that are of relevance. And as you know, now Rakesh Mishra has become director of the Tata Institute for Genetics and Society. Another very overlapping interest he has right from the beginning when he was at CCMB, and we are very lucky to have him in this period of time, and then also very lucky to have him as one of the speakers here. And he would be talking about variant factor in the COVID-19 pandemic. And Rakesh. You are muted, Rakesh.
Okay. Thank you, Madhu. Thank you very much for organizing this. I hope you can hear and see my slides.
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Great. Wonderful. So you have just heard really fantastic talks. And after listening to Dr. Reddy, looks like what I'm going to say will sound very mundane, looking for the variant and mutations while we are talking about the public health and so on. But these are relevant things because variants are important and they do decide sometimes certain things. So I hope I will make a little bit interesting. So I have put some colorful slides to attract the attention and cheat your attention to listen to what I'm going to say about the variants. There's really no statement to make here that this pandemic has shaken us really badly. Globally, I have put some number that 20 crore confirmed cases, 43 lakh recorded COVID deaths, and in India, 3 crore confirmed cases and 4 lakh recorded deaths. And you just heard that these numbers may be very, very far from the reality, and actual numbers and losses are far, far beyond these numbers. This pandemic has done so many things. Okay. So what this pandemic also has done, it has catalyzed research revolution to understand this virus, this SARS-CoV-2. And the efforts were so focused and so vigorous that from a novel virus to a vaccine, to multiple vaccines within a year, very few of us actually imagined that it will come. So that was the intensity of science that was focused on this virus. And one aspect which I'm going to talk about is the emergence of the new variants, which is really a very important feature of this virus. And before we go to the variants, we just very quickly, I will say that this virus is made of RNA as its genetic material, which is 30,000 bases long, and it codes some 30 viral proteins. And first reference genome was deposited on 6 January 2020. Somehow slides, okay. So this genome of this virus, so this virus is made of multiple things. Most important are these structures that you say, you can see a spike protein, then there is nucleocapsid, then there are envelope proteins, and all these items on this virus are encoded by its genome. And one of the part which is called spike protein is very famous and is coded from this part of the genome. And that's actually the business end of the virus. Why business end? For some reason, the slides don't move. Okay. Business end, because the virus has this spike protein which is jutting out from its surface. These are the proteins that read the surface of the human epithelial cells through the protein which is jutting out here called ACE2 receptors. And that is how the virus enters and then goes into the wherever ACE2 receptors are, generally in the lungs, and they make many number of copies. And whenever one person is breathing or sneezing, they can come out and infect others. So that is why we know that we have to use mask, we have to wash hand, and we have to keep social distancing. If we do this, actually we can control this virus quite well. Now coming back to the mutants and variants and lineages that we are going to talk now. So a mutation is a change in the genetic material of the virus when it replicates. And virus replicates only inside the human host. So more infected people means more mutations that are likely to happen. And mutations happen by chance. There is no design, there is no directionality, they're all random. But the selection is of the mutation that is going to go further or going to go larger number of people, actually based on the fitness of the virus. Fitness of the virus is measured as advantages that are given to virus by the mutation. So therefore, it will be represented in more samples. If it is disadvantageous to the virus, then it will be wiped out and it will not be hanging around, it will not be seen after some time. And more mutation doesn't mean more dangerous, but it just means more possibility of new things in the virus. So variants are viruses with one or more mutations compared to the reference, and lineage is the set of viruses that share common ancestor from where many variants have emerged. And during this pandemic, SARS-CoV-2 has accumulated about 2 mutations per month is the rate with which the new variants or mutants are emerging from this virus. When we talk about variants are of two kinds. We look at them at two states. One is variant of interest. When something has changed in the virus, and by the way, this is happening because we notice because we do constant genome surveillance of the virus, sequencing the genome from different patients' samples all the time. So if change is happening in the, let's say, receptor binding part of the protein of the virus, or it is happening in a place where virus has a more chance to escape the immune system, or it has potential to escape diagnostics, then these are based on the mutation, one can suspect something, so they are called then the variants of interest. They get the status of variants of concern when there is evidence that it is increased infectivity, now this present in more number of people. Maybe it is associated with more severe disease, or it is escaping vaccine immunity and so on. Then they become variants of concern. And at present, as per the WHO websites, we have these are the variants of concern, which I think is now, these are household names, alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And these are the variants of interest, which have some mutation, which are suspiciously dangerous, but they are yet to be established. So therefore, they are still kept as variants of interest. One thing which I want to bring it here, that the different names of these viruses, alpha virus, B.1, 1.7, and so on, their various names. So you see the dates here that this alpha virus or UK variants was there in September 2020, but it acquired the status of variant of concern in December 2020. So it takes a long time, in fact, several months from the virus to come in circulation, and then to be recognized the true extent of its importance in the pandemic. It takes long time, and by then probably a lot of damage is already done. So it's really tricky thing how quickly we can detect a variant. To detect a variant, we have to do this sequencing of the genome, and that is now very well established. And the way the sequencing is done is you take the RNA, take the sample, and then purify the RNA, convert that into a DNA, and then amplify parts, bits and pieces of this virus. So they are roughly, say, 400 odd nucleotide long, and they are then the sequence in a next generation sequencing machines. So you cover the entire virus genome by set of primer pairs and amplicons, so that when you sequence, you can assemble and get the sequence with you in few hours. And once the sequence is ready, then it goes to a common website called GSAD, where whole world deposited sequence, and then we can compare and contrast and look at various metadata that is available and make some sense out of those sequences that have generated. The sooner you go to GSAD, more value of your data and more outcome you can have from your sequencing efforts. Just sequencing and saying I sequence so many just doesn't mean anything unless it goes to a public domain when more people can use it. So in CCMD, we have been sequencing the virus for quite some time, almost really from the very beginning, to monitor the mutations and that lead to the rise of new variants, and interpret them in the context of increased transmission or stronger receptor binding on a higher viral load, potential to escape diagnostic, and so many other things. Right? So it is very crucial actually to keep collecting samples from patients and keep monitoring by genome sequencing and linking it to something unusual that may be seen. To do all this on a continuous basis for the sequences, not only the one that we generate, but also the sequences that are available in public domain, we have made a website called Gear19, which is a genome data resource for tracking the dynamics and the evolution of the SARS-CoV-2 isolate. So you can go to this site, you can play it very user-friendly. It's an India-centric resource and related metadata and interactive visualization tool. And I will give some examples. For example, till few days back, we have 44,000 or let's say 45,000 sequences that are deposited from India. And we have cataloged 46,000 mutations in these deposited sequences, and they are coming from, generated from 35 labs for 34 states and so on. And these are various clades that have been identified in this. So one thing you should notice, you may notice immediately, is that number of mutations that are there cataloged are more than actually the number of sequences that have deposited. So there's so many mutations keep happening, and that's the power of this virus for its survival, that it keeps changing so that it can deal with the situations that it faces, whether it's immunity or drug or whatever. The other thing which we also noticed, which was seen in all over the world, was that the number of people infected in India, there are more males. Males always take a bigger piece of the cake, but in this time also they have taken the bigger piece, and which is not very good. Anyway, jokes aside, so this is some peculiar observation seen all over the world, that generally we see more males than females that have been found with this infection. This is to show you again another view of the variants, that this is actually the plot which shows this is the timeline, and these are different from different states, different clades that we have plotted, and this is the all India when all these things are merged. You can see more colorful region of this graph in this part, this early part of the pandemic. As you go more and more advanced in terms of time and come to more recent, then you see that all other colors are gone and only one color is remaining, largely one color. So which means that lots of variants were hanging around and emerging in the beginning, which is shown like here. So you see many variants, but they keep disappearing, and only few of them which survive and pass the various criteria of survival and spread, they are seen. So you can actually track back and see how beta or gamma or delta or alpha have originated from which lineage. We can go back and track a little bit. This is something to impress you that, let's say, in January this year, there were many, each color reflects different variants. So you have some 5-6 variants, which were major variants seen in India. And by June, July, you see you have only one color. That means, and this color belongs to Delta variant. So Delta has actually overpowered and practically removed all other variants now, at least in India. It's very rare that you find any other variant. Most of, I mean, in CCMB, we are seeing for many days 100% Delta variant coming. So this has replaced now all other variants, and which is very interesting. And we are investigating many things related to why one variant has dominated now completely. This is the timeline of variants globally and in India. And the few things I would like you to notice, like, let's say here, the alpha variant emerged in December in UK, and in India also around the same time, you can see alpha variants is noticed. Beta variant in South Africa emerged in December 2020. In India also it emerged in December 2020. On the other hand, the gamma, which emerged in January, came to India much later, after 3 months, the first sample that are noticed. So in this case, either it is around the same time or we are behind in getting the variant. But Kappa and Delta, we have seen before it was seen anywhere else. This also relates to this, they originated here. So this, after originating, as you can see, these viruses originate and then spread in different places by travel, generally by air travel from one place to other. And in fact, the alpha variant spread in India can be very well mapped how, when it came. So similarly, the Kappa and Delta from India, they originated and went elsewhere. So this shows one thing, that it takes quite a short time from for the virus to spread from one continent to other, and that is adding to this pandemic much more than what if it had happened before the air travel was that common. Second thing also is that, as you can see, that in India we did notice the variant Delta or Kappa before it was recorded in other places. So that means our genome surveillance in some ways is picking things reasonably in time. How much we make use of those information is a different story, but that the mutation is there and it is spreading is obvious, and it's been picked before elsewhere in the world. This is again the map of the virus, and these lines that you see, they are showing that these are the mutations that have led to at least virus spread in some parts of the population at some time. So this is all cumulative number. And as you can see there, while they're all across the genome, you see changes happening, but some places changes are more. And it makes sense because these near changes are happening more because the spike protein, which is the business end of the virus, and the virus uses this part to attack the human cells. That's why it makes the changes which help the virus happening in this are more consequential, and that's why you see more successful mutations emerging from this region. So just to indicate to you that this is the virus and this is the key which is being tried. You have multiple types of key this virus is making, and whichever key fits best with the host cell lock, which is the ACE2, will be the selected one. So multiple permutation combinations keep happening, and the virus keeps using this. And therefore, immediately it becomes very sensitive site that if you can block it somehow, here it's shown that an antibody is coming and sitting. So instead of receptor, now antibody is making this virus useless for infections. So that is where the some parts of the virus, mutation will happen everywhere, but some of the mutants will be more visible to us. This is the genetic map of the virus mutant that were very famous at some time. They were called double mutant or triple mutant. So it's actually, they are not double triple mutant. Before they got a name, they were identified, and for some reason they were called double triple because of these particular mutations they were noticed. But these are mutations now, they have their names, and there are 14, 15 or 16 mutations. So number of mutation doesn't mean something more fearful or something. It's just that certain combinations of mutations are somehow letting the virus do better than other versions that are around, and therefore seeing more often. For example, the current variants, very little now, but till some time back, one is the beta, which has, these are the key mutations in this. So it was first identified in South Africa, the earliest sequence in India in December, and very few of these numbers. So, but it has cause of concern because these are the mutations which are related to, like this is in increased RBD, this is receptor binding domain, binding affinity to S2. So this virus will have a better key to open the entry gate for of the cell. This is reduced susceptibility to neutralization. This means it can avoid antibodies. So some of the immunotherapy may not work, and it may infect even vaccinated people, and so on. Similarly, the most famous one now in India, all over the world, is the Delta variant, which has some key mutations, like again, L452R, which is increased viral transmissibility and infectivity. It has enhanced stabilization of the complex, that will better, more tight binding, and ignoring the antibodies, and that is the reason this virus has spread all over the world. Now you see practically, and this is going to be the variant to deal with for some time. What we notice here is that there are convergent evolution of this virus, which means these are the key mutations that we have been talking about. And these mutations actually independently are seen in other variants well before they converged into Delta, so which is indicated here. So this means it's not like that various variants are combining and contributing one mutation to other. It means that these mutations are emerging independently and making a successful variant. So that, as I said, this virus mutates heavily. All RNA viruses mutate because that is their strength. So random mutation also, some of the combination of the mutations which involve these changes are more successful. So they are the ones that give advantage to the virus. So that's why they are selected again and again, and they are seen multiple times. So it brings 2 points. Are these the only options? Why again and again we are seeing prominent variants showing similar kind of mutations? And if so, then is the virus running out of options, and it has reached a fitness which is now something like upper limit, if one can call to say. These are not the statement I'm making. I'm just asking questions because these observations point to us to bother in those directions. What we have seen now, there are many reports also that this viral load is about 1,000 times higher than the people in Delta variant than in others. So that's why it is very, very infectious, because it can give enough dose for in very short duration, and the incubation period is very short. So therefore, it has acquired lots of good things for the virus to be very, very infectious. Any living being, including viruses, they just want to live. They don't want to kill anybody, because they don't get anything by making anybody sick or anybody die. They gain only if they can spread from one individual to other. And it looks like Delta has acquired many of those features. So is Delta too efficient, and is the virus stabilizing to an endemic state, that there is a virus which is very good, but which is all right to have around, and so on. And I will just make just show couple of slides about the reinfection and so on. So while that looks a little bit interesting, that maybe we are reaching where the virus is achieving its peak, but we also notice variants which are emerging from Delta. So they are called Delta plus in general, particularly AY1, AY2, and AY3. These are, and there is another one, AY 3.1, which is, they haven't acquired any status yet of concern or of interest or something, but they are there around, and we are noticing them. So for instance, this is the Delta variant, and these are the changes that are written there. So if the changes take place or not based on this. So this kind of sign means this change doesn't take place. Darker means more often this mutation is seen, and so on. So like AY1, AY2, they have been there. They have many changes which are similar to Delta, but they have new mutations they have acquired. But they are not so common. But one of these, AY3, is something which has been seen now 17,000 cases all around the world, and slowly increasing its footprint. And India also is gradually increasing. 261 cases have been seen here. So looking at, so these are early days. Because of sequence information, we are now noticing such changes. So these raises the question that maybe not, maybe Delta has not reached a peak, or maybe it has, we do not know. But these things in coming week, we will know, are these the variants that are better than Delta, and they, because we see gradually something is increasing, even in when Delta is around, having increasing in the footprint is something one has to take note of. Are they going to replace the Delta? And if so, are they more difficult in the sense they will cause more reinfection, more clinical symptoms of worse kind, or vaccine breakthrough? These are questions that we have to very carefully follow, and very closely watch, particularly AY3 and AY 3.1, to see if they are increasing with a faster rate, and therefore more containment and more efforts may be needed in those directions. So these are the kinds of concerns or excitements we can extract from the genomic surveillance if it is happening in an efficient manner. But there are lots of difficulties, and that's why it's not that simple to interpret this data and make a very strong statement early on. In retrospect, we can give Gyan very well, but in the real time, it is very difficult to interpret for a variety of reasons, and some of them are listed here. So one is more the sequence, more information, and better it is. But how much we should sequence, how much is enough? And there is no real answer to this. We can discuss, but sequencing costs time, is effort, money. Therefore, you have to optimize and find a good number which is useful, but not the wasteful at the same time. And factors that influence, even if you have large number, is not only the number, it depends the sample collection in very significant way. The clinical samples recorded, whether you have collected, you can sequence the entire colony, hundreds of people. It doesn't mean anything because you are sequencing the same thing again and again. So it doesn't help. So therefore, there should be some rationale in collecting these sequences, like clinical symptoms, vaccinated people, if they are getting infected, reinfection cases, they are very important. One has to, because a new variant might be somewhere there. And local super spreader incidents, is it a new variant that has emerged, or is the people who have helped the virus spread? On geographically randomized samples, which is a huge challenge in India. India is like a whole Europe, right? So to collect samples in randomized way from all geographical locations and sequence them and make the results available quickly is really a huge challenge. And as I mentioned, the availability of the information to those who can use it in time, so that better policy and logistics are put in place. It sounds trivial, but it is a big issue. And sample collection and submission time lag is another thing which those who are not in this business will find it very surprising. Here is a study a couple of days back that has been submitted by IBAB, Nature Biotechnology. You can see that the delay between sample collection to actually submitting the sample to the database, even in a country like England and all who are doing it very efficiently, is 15, 20 days, up to 20 days it takes. So 20 days, you don't know actually, even if you have collected the sample. So everything you can, when you say real time, you're talking about a month back, what has happened. And if you go to other places, it's very much worse. India is somewhere here. And this is the data if country has sequenced at least 1,000. So you can see that we are somewhere here. So that means we are taking about 100 days after collecting the data to, on an average, collecting sample and then to, submitting so that it can be used and interpreted. So this is a big problem, and this has to be addressed, that how we can do that in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, everything is available. The other problem we face is a non-uniform sampling. So this is the how many samples in ratio collected from which state in the country. So like Maharashtra is somewhere here, largest number of samples. This is based on what is deposited in the GSAT. UP is very much here, maybe nth number, although in population, if you see, UP is on the top. And Bihar is some in the third, but Bihar, if you have to really search, it will be somewhere. So yeah, Bihar is here. So that means this is one of these. So we are not, and then how we can talk of a national policy strategy when we do not have the data collected. It's not that the number of infections were less in these places. So the sequencing is not happening all over in an efficient way. So that unless that is addressed, it's very difficult to make a lot of sense. In local analysis can be done, but national level is difficult. And one thing which is of concern is that these are the number of samples deposited in on monthly basis from January. Before January, it was much less. So this sequencing effort began this year. So you can see that gradually it picked up in June, 14,000 samples, but August we have very little, July it is coming down. So that means we are kind of sequencing less than we were doing a month or two back. So that is about the variant I wanted to talk, and I'll close by just showing you a couple of slides. One is that some key factors that are variant independent. These are very repetitive and boring, but I think they are so important that I don't feel at all bad in repeating them, which is that no variant can break through proper mask. So to defeat corona, we must use mask. That is very, very important. And not wearing mask in public is being uncivil, because you are not only infecting, transmitting helping the virus coming to you, but also to your own friends and family members. Then no variant can spread without people's cooperation. So if we do not cluster, if we avoid being in a closed space and in crowd, we can actually do good job in controlling the pandemic. And any variant can be a platform for evolution of dangerous variants, because that is the only way the worst will emerge if we let the virus keep playing around with more and more infected people. So stop this spread now and don't challenge the virus. Avoid this is what we should be doing. Vaccination has been real boon. You're going to hear in detail from Shahid, who's an expert in this. And I'm looking forward to that. But the vaccine is really helping. Even CCMB study shows that either of the vaccines, Covishield or Covaxin, if you have, then there is a big advantage in not getting severity or less death rate. Is very clear cut. So vaccine, and not only that, vaccine is useful. Even yesterday, I think this study came in meta-archive that if you see more and more vaccination, the mutation rate is decreased. So that means if there is more vaccination, then the less variants will emerge. And that is in some ways counterintuitive, because when you vaccine, you are now giving a challenge to virus. You are giving a selection screen for the virus to come with more infectious and immune escapable variants. But at the same time, you are choking the virus so that there is less number infected and less virus production. Therefore, chances are decreasing. So as a net outcome, what we are observing at the moment, at least from this study, is that more vaccination means less mutation frequency that is observed. Will it hold? How long it will be like this? One can't vouch for, but it's very good sign. And my last slide is the third wave and the end of the pandemic is the question that we can all speculate without really being sure. But few things are, in my view, the factors that are going to determine how this, there will be a wave or there will be a ripple or there will be a disaster. Unlikely, maybe, but these are the factors that are going to decide how well we are going to use mask. That is going to decide if we are avoiding clustering, especially in closed spaces, if vaccination and boosters are planned and implemented, and we keep doing this. But one thing which I'm a little worried is that large-scale testing, tracing, and isolating is required, even if number of cases are reducing or we are comfortable with that. These are in our control, and as a and some things are to be done by the government, some things are to be done by people. All of us have to fight together. But certain things like increasing and persistent seropositivity is not in our control. How long this will stay, we do not know. No new variant surprises come, that is not in our control. But if these two factors play a little bit with us and we do our part, I think we can kind of face the next pandemic without much of pain. So with that, thank you very much for this opportunity to describe what we've been thinking about with the variants in more of recent time, and what are how these variants have emerged and how they might new variants may come, or maybe we have reached a point where we have got a very smart virus and there's less scope to have something worse than that. So thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Rakesh. I think that's a kind of sweeping state of affairs of variants, not only in India and across the globe. I think a lot of people will better informed on the, not only on the variants, but also on the biology behind it, and also the choices that we may have to, prevent the frequency of mutations, basically depending on the replication that if you don't allow no additional ones, so no further variants and things like that. I think that's a very important message I'm sure people will carry. And also when you talk about these the rapidness in which the information should go back to the authorities is extremely important. I think that was also brought very nicely by Dr. Jacob. Is the definition of Indian definition of public health versus the global definition of public health essentially reflects what you have been saying. If you have interesting data, it should be immediately available to the public health officials to make a call. I think that's I think that is good to, this message should go around, and then we should be able to decrease our turnaround time so that it is more useful than, because the disease itself has very short life, short incubation time per individual. I think the quickness with which you put it back into the information, I think that has a great benefit. Thank you very much for such a very nice talk, and we will take the questions. We have a couple of them, but what we will do is we'll just look at them at the end of the thing. I think we have the pleasure of hearing Dr. Shahid Zamil now, and to all the viewers, Dr. Shahid Zamil is a very accomplished virologist, initially from ICGAB, and then he was the director of Wellcome Trust India Alliance, which is one of the very powerful and very effective body that supports a lot of young investigators. And now he's the director of School of Biosciences at Ashoka University. And he comes up with enormous amount of experience, and then his role in various policy making bodies gives him a first-hand perspective on the challenges at hand. I request Dr. Shahid Jamil to come and then present his talk.
Thank you very much, Madhu and Ramji and everyone else for the invitation. The trouble is that when you speak after Jacob John and Rakesh and everyone else, there's very much left to say. Nevertheless, since people haven't really covered vaccines, I would like to cover vaccines. And of course, Dr. Srinath Reddy, what a fantastic talk. So let me share my screen and get on with it. I hope you can see it clearly.
Yes, Shahid.
Wonderful. Right. So I will be talking about vaccines, and obviously I will be talking more on COVID vaccines than anything else. But before I do that, let me give you a little bit of vaccine 101, which I'm sure all of you know, but since there may be students here, it's for their benefit. So the question is, what is a vaccine? And the picture here is the famous painting of Edward Jenner inoculating a young boy, James Phipps, with material from cowpox to prevent smallpox. And this is dated late 18th century, 1796 or 98. So the question is, what is a vaccine? A vaccine is essentially the biological preparation that allows our body to gain active immunity against a pathogen before we get exposed to the pathogen. So obviously it contains something which resembles the pathogen, and this something, usually a protein, usually a part of the pathogen, stimulates the immune system, recognize the pathogen when we actually get infected, destroy it, and most importantly, to retain memory for the future. So everyone who's worried that their antibody levels have dipped after taking, after a certain time of taking COVID vaccines, don't worry, because your body would have made enough memory cells to protect you from serious disease. Okay, so the way immunity works is, and I'm for simplicity, I'm just talking about antibodies here, but implicit in this is also T cells, especially killer T cells. So if we have existing immunity to a pathogen, either by virtue of prior exposure to the pathogen or because of being vaccinated against it, then our body can protect us. And the examples shown here are measles, chickenpox, and flu. But then when a new pathogen comes, for which we have not had any experience in the human population, and the example, of course, is SARS coronavirus 2, we have no pre-existing immunity, and it runs wild. It runs like crazy in the population. And this is what has happened. So the way you make a vaccine is to take a part of the pathogen and immunize with this part of the pathogen. And your body will raise an immune response, again, typically shown by an antibody here. And this is essentially what is done for COVID also. We take the spike protein in various forms, whether it's in the form of an inactivated virus, or whether it is RNA going into our cells and making the protein, or whether it is a viral vector that is used for the purpose. The purpose really is to make this foreign protein so that our body can raise an immune response. Now, before going further, this is a very interesting slide that shows the value of vaccines. Firstly, in monetary terms, simply return on investment, it is estimated that for every dollar that is spent on vaccines, on developing vaccines, on manufacturing vaccines, and on distributing vaccines, it brings a return of $44. And this is by way of children growing up into healthy, productive adults and helping economies. Now, if you look at this chart, the rows are diseases and the columns are years or decades rather. The brown circle is the time when the vaccine was introduced. And you see that for any vaccine, let's take measles, for example. Before the mid-1960s, measles was really running wild in the population, shown by the size of the circles. But after vaccination started with the measles vaccine, the size of the circles went down, meaning the incidence of the disease went down. And it's the same case for almost every disease for which there is a vaccine available. So the point is vaccines are valuable. They're the most economic public health tool, and they work very, very well. Okay, so before we understand how COVID vaccines work, let us understand how the virus enters cells, because central to how COVID vaccines work is to understand how virus makes an entry into cells. And the virus enters cells by binding to certain receptors on the cell. We know this as the ACE2 receptor, and the ACE2 receptor is bound by the virus through these knobs on the surface of the virus, which is the spike protein of the virus. And just focus on the right-hand side, the virus has to enter cells.
I request all participants to mute yourselves. Thank you.
When the virus has to, when the virus has to enter cells, it binds to this receptor, which is called ACE2. But very close in proximity to ACE2 is another molecule, which is called TMPRSS, which is basically a protease. Now, when the virus attaches through its spike protein to the ACE2 receptor, the protease here causes a cleavage in the spike protein. And it is this cleavage that results in an irreversible reaction, which allows the viral membrane to fuse with the cellular membrane. And that's how the virus enters the cell. Now, you may have heard a lot about this furin cleavage site in the spike protein. Furin is another protease available on the surface of cells, especially human cells. And this is also able to cleave the spike to the same effect. So if there is an inbuilt furin site in the protein, it allows the virus to enter cells much better. So here it is shown in greater detail. On the left, you see a diagram of the spike protein, and it's essentially a spike trimer. And you see the two subunits, the S1 subunit and the S2 subunit. And there is a cleavage between S1 and S2 that then allows the virus to fuse. Now, the virus, of course, and the spike proteins are not static. They are always flopping around, moving around. And one of the hypotheses for why Delta has such high transmissibility is that the mutation in Delta has made this region, the stalk region, more flexible. So the spike protein can flop around much better. And by flopping around much better, it is able to scan the surface of the cell much better for the receptor and is able to locate the receptor much more easily, far more quickly. Of course, on the protein, there is this receptor binding domain on the spike through which the spike protein binds to the ACE2 receptor on the cell surface. And this is showing viral entry up close. So here is the spike trimer that binds to ACE2 and temperus comes out and does the cleavage. And when this cleavage happens, the S1 subunit falls off, but the S2 subunit reveals a 6-bundle helix, which has a hydrophobic end, which attaches to the viral membrane. And it is this that brings the viral membrane and the cellular membrane very close to each other to cause fusion. The way HIV enters cells is also pretty much the same, except that HIV has GP120 and GP41, whereas here we have S1 and S2. Okay, so now let's try and understand what kind of COVID vaccines are available and how these COVID vaccines work. So there are several types of vaccines in development. One is these traditional whole virus vaccines. And so far, we don't really have a live attenuated COVID vaccine, but we have several inactivated vaccines, including our Indian vaccine, Covaxin. Here, the idea is to grow lots of virus and then to chemically inactivate it and then add an adjuvant to it and use it as a vaccine. Of course, this is very old technology, and this has been a very successful technology. But you will realize that these vaccines are not exactly easy to make, because this virus being a biosafety level 3 pathogen, all the manufacturing has to be done in a BSL-3 condition. So typically for Covaxin, a single lot of vaccine takes about 4 months to make. So it's not an easy vaccine. Idea is easy, but the process is not. What has really been a revelation with COVID are genetic vaccines, especially the RNA vaccines. And you know these as Pfizer BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines. The idea is to encapsulate the RNA for the spike protein in a lipoprotein, in a lipid particle. And this is delivered into our cells. Why the lipid particle? Because as you know, RNA is a very unstable molecule. The same concept for DNA, except that DNA is a much more stable molecule. And it's just one step back. So DNA will make RNA and RNA will make protein in our cells. And the first COVID DNA vaccine has been made by Zydus Cadila, which has undergone phase 3 trials with good results. And this is now with the Indian regulator for approval. If we can make stable RNA vaccines, especially thermostable RNA vaccines, and if we can make DNA vaccines that have high immunogenicity, I mean, the current vaccine takes 3 shots, which is a problem. If we can solve these problems, then these are vaccines for the future. And of course, the famous viral vector vaccines like Covishield in our country and several other vaccines around the world, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the Sputnik vaccine, they use a virus, typically an adenovirus, which is a cold-causing virus, to deliver the DNA for the spike protein into cells, and then this makes the protein. And the final class of vaccines are protein vaccines. Novavax has already made a nanoparticle protein vaccine, which has shown very good results. And Sanofi Pasteur is also making another protein vaccine, which is the spike protein expressed from insect cells. So there are several of these vaccines that have been in development. The story at this time, and this is till 9th of August, a few days back, we have over 120, 125 vaccines that are in various stages of human clinical testing. There are 11 vaccines that have received emergency use approval, and these are listed on the side here. And 8 of these vaccines have been approved for full use in several countries. So you see that COVID is barely 1.5 years old, and we already have so many vaccines in the pipeline. And if there is any celebration of science, at the top, it is how scientists have produced vaccines so quickly. But we also got lucky that antibodies to the spike protein protect. It's been more than 40 years since HIV was discovered. HIV GP120 is a very antigenic molecule, but antibodies to it don't protect. So in a way, we were lucky with COVID. Okay, so how do these vaccines work? Let's look at Covaxin first. And I'm just going to talk about the two vaccines in India. So Covaxin makes antibodies. And the way it does is that you take the virus, you grow it, you inactivate it with a chemical called beta-proteolactone, and you then inject it. This is taken by antigen-presenting cells. The virus is digested, and the virus components are presented to helper T cells. These helper T cells allow B cells to mature into plasma cells, and these plasma cells secrete antibodies that can bind to the live virus and inactivate it. So that's how Covaxin works. The way Covishield works is that it makes both antibodies as well as killer T cells. And the way it does this is you've taken the gene for the spike protein, engineered it into an adenovirus, and in this case, it's a chimpanzee adenovirus. Now, when this adenovirus is injected, it is taken up by cells. The DNA is converted into RNA and into the spike protein, shown here. And the spike protein is presented on the cell surface as a protein, but also as peptides in the context of both MHC class 1 and MHC class 2. When it is presented as MHC class 2 associated peptide, helper T cells are activated, secrete cytokines, allow B cells to mature into plasma cells and produce antibodies, just like that we've seen for Covaxin. However, in this case, since the protein is being made from within the cell, it is also presented in the context of MHC class 1 by antigen-presenting cells. And this activates CD8 cells, which mature into killer T cells. And these killer T cells are able to then kill virus-infected cells. So while antibodies are there to neutralize extracellular viruses, killer T cells are able to remove the reservoir of infected cells, and that's how these vaccines work. Okay, so what is the status of vaccinations? Let's look at the global picture, and if you see this picture, one thing becomes quite clear is that a lot of countries have been vaccinating, but it also becomes clear that there is a very serious issue of vaccine equity and vaccine access. Look at the whole continent of Africa and see how small the green dots are and how few the green dots are. In India, we should really be proud that we have given the second highest number of doses in the world. Over 500 million doses of vaccines have been given. And that's largely because of a very good vaccine manufacturing industry in the country. But then if you look at global vaccine coverage, while India has given, and this number is a little older, while India has given very high number of vaccines, the percent people vaccinated in India are only 29%, of which about 8% have got both doses and 21% have got one dose. So because of the huge population, the denominator is very high, and that is the situation. But hopefully as vaccine supplies get better and better, we will vaccinate more and more people. So the question is, how many people are we vaccinating? And if you look at this graph over here, we seem to be vaccinating about 3.5 to 4 million people on a daily basis on average. This number really needs to increase to somewhere in the range of about 8.5 to 10 million doses per day for the rest of the year for us to be able to vaccinate everyone who we want to vaccinate. The other thing to take is there are 3 vaccines in use in India now. Sputnik has just become available, and Sputnik only covers about 0.1% of doses rolled out in India so far. Majority of the vaccination in India is by Covishield, over 87%. Covaxin comes with roughly around 12%. Okay. Now, Rakesh has covered variants, but I think it's important to just refresh your memory very, very quickly. Well, there are 4 variants of concern, and I'm not going to go into that. The thing to understand is that since SARS emerged from China, it has developed variants which have increased in transmissibility. And Delta right now is spreading very widely, and it is a very, very transmissible virus. And this sort of picture shows you how Delta has spread. The top picture shows you the picture globally. The bottom picture shows the situation for India. So globally, Delta really started expanding somewhere around May, mid-May, early June of this year. And by now, 92% of viruses in the world are Delta variants. In India, however, Delta started much earlier. It was first seen in December, or a progenitor virus was seen in December. But Delta started spreading in India quite widely in March of this year. And you know that the second wave was really very bad in April and May, and it was largely because of Delta. So now almost 100% of the virus that circulates in India is Delta. And I'm showing you this because I will discuss whether current vaccines are effective against Delta or not. And here is a map of all the variants of concern mapped to the spike protein. And you will see that most of the key mutations map to not just the receptor binding domain of the spike, but the receptor binding motif, which is really the area that binds to the receptor. And the recent studies by David Stewart and his group have shown this for 3 key mutations. And I'm not going to go into their studies, but simply highlight this result that these key mutations, 484, 417, and 501. You will recall from Rakesh's presentation that 501 first came in the alpha variant. 484 was first seen in the beta variant, and 417 is also seen in both the beta and the gamma variant. 484 is seen in Delta. Delta also has something that's called L452R. But the point is that these mutations are at sites which really dim the antigenicity of the spike protein. So if you have been vaccinated with a protein from the wild type virus, the antibodies that you will make will not bind to these regions very well. They will bind, but they will not bind very well. But do remember that vaccines give a polyclonal response. So it's not that vaccines will completely evade these immune responses. And that is really the case. So do current vaccines work against variant viruses? And the answer is yes. I'm showing you here 4 different studies summarized for the Pfizer mRNA vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine. And all of these show that there is high levels of vaccine effectiveness against Delta because this is, people who get the vaccine are protected from severe disease and hospitalization. Real world data from India, and I'll cite you two studies here. One study from CMC Vellore, which shows that one dose protects anywhere from 61% to 95%, depending upon what your metric is, if you're looking at infection or if you're looking at hospitalization or oxygen need or ICU. And of course, protection goes up considerably when you take both doses of the vaccine. Another study on effectiveness from the Tamil Nadu Police Department also looked at death, and you will see that if you have no vaccine, there is a certain risk factor involved for death. And if you call this as a risk factor of 1, if you take 1 dose of vaccine, this is reduced almost 5 times. And if you take both doses of vaccines, it is reduced about 20 times. So vaccines are effective, and these tests have been done at a time when Delta has been spreading in the country. Another large study by the Apollo Hospital Group, although this study has not been published, they claim that out of 31,000 vaccinated healthcare workers at Apollo hospitals around the country, less than 5% got symptomatic COVID, and there were no deaths. Finally, from UK, and if you look at the second wave in UK and the third wave in UK, you will see that in the second wave, vaccination rates were very low. So hospitalizations were also high and death was high. But in the third wave in UK, when vaccination rates had gone up considerably, hospitalizations have been reduced significantly and deaths have been reduced even more. So again, all these evidences show that while the currently available vaccines will not protect from symptomatic infection very well, they protect from hospitalization and death. They protect from severe disease very, very well. So what is the future of vaccines? And to really illustrate this, I go back to the past of vaccines. And this I found to be a very cute illustration. I think all of you who are my age, if you look on your left arm, you will see some round marks. And those round marks are smallpox vaccination. Those are scars from the smallpox vaccination. So, you know, the smallpox vaccine worked, and it worked to eliminate smallpox. The polio vaccine has worked, and it has worked to eliminate polio, almost eliminate polio. But I'll come back to the point that Jacob raised, and Srinath also addressed that. Those are the only 2 viruses that have been eradicated. For eradicating a virus, what you really need is not just good vaccination, but the virus should not have any animal reservoir. You know, both smallpox and polio had human-to-human transmission. COVID, SARS-CoV-2, or any coronavirus, we will never be able to eliminate simply because it will go and hide in the animal reservoir. You know, even if you kill all the bats in the world, you're not going to eliminate coronaviruses because they also have other unknown animal systems where they are found. So what is the future? I mean, I go back to 2013 when a synthetic influenza vaccine was prepared in 5 days. So instead of actually shipping the virus, sequence information of the vaccine lot of virus was sent to companies, and these were quickly made into viruses and therefore vaccines. Look at what has happened in 2020. And this is the story of the Moderna vaccine. You may not be able to read this very well, so let me read it for you. On 11th of January, Chinese scientists released the genetic sequence of the virus. On 13th of January, Moderna had already designed their RNA vaccine 2 days later. And on February 7th, the first clinical batch was manufactured. And to cut a long story short, on 16th of March, barely 62 or 63 days from the time the sequence was known or released, the first vaccine dose had gone into a volunteer. And of course, by December 18th of 2020, all the trials were done and FDA had authorized this vaccine for emergency use. So the speed at which things have worked is phenomenal. You know, a lot of people complain that we don't know whether these vaccines are safe because they have been developed so quickly. But I can assure you, if you are around when the next pandemic hits, people will be saying a COVID vaccine was made in less than a year. Why can't vaccine X be made in 2 months? This is how our expectations will go. And this is how science is moving to fulfill those expectations. And I'll possibly end by showing you a development that has happened recently. And the provocative question is, can really vaccines be printed on demand in future? So there's this company called Codex DNA, which has a system which can be programmed remotely. It's basically a synthesizer and can also do in vitro RNA synthesis reactions. You can program it from anywhere and it will churn out the sequence. So now imagine if DNA becomes, we learn how to make DNA more immunogenic, and we learn how to stabilize RNA, we can essentially print vaccines in doctors' offices in future, where you can go in, the vaccine will be printed, and it will be given to you. Now that is called distributed manufacturing. You don't have to rely on very big factories to make vaccines. You can distribute it all over the world. So the question of access and equity will also be addressed to a large extent. Of course, we will discover other problems, but at least that problem may be solved. And here, this is the system. So I don't want to be advertising the system or. So another provocative question that I would like to ask, and we just end here, is can we make vaccines even before a pathogen has emerged? We don't know what will cause the next pandemic. Can we discover those pathogens? And can we make vaccines and keep vaccines? And why just vaccines? Diagnostic tests. Can we make diagnostic tests available even before a pathogen has ever been seen in a human or animal population? And this is something that the Global Virome Project aims to look at. Their aim is to discover over 500,000 viruses from animal species. Now, it is estimated that bats alone have roughly 3,000 species of coronaviruses, and we have barely seen 4 or 5 of them. So this obviously is a worthwhile thing to do, to figure out what infects some of these animals, bats and rodents, to be more precise. What stands in the way is really the cost of a project like this. It would cost about $5 billion to discover 500,000 viruses in this program. Now, in 2018 or 2019, this was a very large sum of money. But in 2021, this is not a large sum of money, simply because the COVID cost is estimated upwards of 25 trillion. That's 1,000 times more than a billion. So I think technology, and more than technology, our mindset, our thinking is moving towards that. And in future, we may be able to make vaccines even before a pathogen has emerged. So let me just stop there and be happy to answer questions now or later.
Thank you, Dr. Zamil. I think that's again a white canvas that we painted right from the basics to what the future can offer. I think we're looking at some of the data about the efficacy of vaccine. I think, is it possible to make them printed on our currency notes so that people will be this COVID, the vaccine hesitancy might go off. You know, I mean, like people are not aware of the efficacy of the vaccines. I think it should be much more louder and clear so that. And in fact, I read somewhere, I think the pandemic is of the unvaccinated. You know, I think more people need to be vaccinated. I think that message comes out. The efficacy of the vaccines comes out so clearly. I think really appreciate for bringing in such a important information. I hope a lot of people take this message and spread it around, especially those who are hesitant to get vaccinated. Thank you very much for again for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you, sir, anytime. Thank you. And we have a talk from Shishir. Shishir has been, we know him for a while, and he's been a kind of entrepreneur for more than a decade, or maybe much more, couple of decades, I guess. He was involved in diagnostics industry to begin with, and he's one of the guys who rose up early for the diagnostic area and saw the opportunity there, and quickly pivoted his activities towards development of RT-PCR. And he was with us for a short while, but he grew quickly and has his own establishment in the city, Hyderabad. And Dr. Shishir, please share your experiences with us.
Hi. Am I clear?
Yeah, you are.
After this intriguing talks of all giants like Dr. Jamil and Dr. Reddy and others, Dr. Jacob, it's very difficult to get audience for talks like a commercial element like us. So essentially, we actually work on molecular diagnostics, and we started working on molecular diagnostics a decade ago. Though pandemic have actually showed lots of gray hair on everybody, I'm not 2 decades old. I'm 1 decade old in the industry. So we basically started molecular diagnostics 10 years ago, and then subsequently we started one company called Arrays Life Sciences, which has been acquired by Biomerio, a French company. And subsequently in 2017, we exited that company and started QWell Life Sciences. QWell essentially means human welfare. So in 20, we had our own set of entrepreneurial learning, because actually mostly went in what exactly is not to be done during the period where we interacted with MNC and where we did lots of different assay development, documentation, CE marking and other stuff done there. And then apart from that, what to be done and what to be not done in terms of entrepreneurial line. So what we got in our previous experience. So in 2017, we started working on different assays. So we are basically started developing various assays. In 2017 itself, we got manufacturing licenses. 2018, we got to work on BIRAC project, which is the National Biopharma Mission have given us in a project to the tune of 2 CR on making lyophilized products. So we were with some enzymes in 2017. We started working with Taq polymerase. Why we started this working on stack polymerase, which is probably everybody felt is a trivial enzyme, which is to be used in every lab. Unfortunately, we didn't get a good quality Taq polymerase for the disease diagnostics, because every time it either used to be inconsistent with units, or it used to be with E. coli DNA contamination. So it was very difficult for using those enzymes in diagnostics. So then we started making Taq polymerase, and then we modified Taq polymerase, and we have mutant Taq and also made hot start DNA Taq polymerase. And then we had MMLB, which is used for RT RNA viruses amplification. And we had an essay of around, we had essays of around 20-25 essays in 2017, where we went for manufacturing licenses with GCGI, which is a small unit in Hyderabad. And in subsequently, in 2018, we had this project and we started with dengue and hepatitis B as a model organism, model virus or model for DNA and RNA viruses, or essentially for demonstrating lyophilization and developed a complete full-fledged assay. So what we have seen is lots of -20 shipments have created issues at the customer end, because storage and transportation at -20 have become a very big challenge, both for us and for them at the end user. So then we thought the dry down format would be more sensible. So we went into development of those assays and successfully validated those two and completed the project within a year's time. But in 2019, we had officially launched around 26 parameters across country, which includes all infections, genetic diseases, and other cancer detection assays, which include BCR-ABL, PML-RARA detection, and quantitation in a single tube. So we have applied for a couple of patents. But subsequently, in early 2020, the country got struck with COVID. So we had this understanding. We went to CDC site and downloaded a few different sequences of COVID-19, and then we had the same multiple sequence alignment and subsequently designed our own assay. And then we actually, unfortunately, we had to go pillar to post to get validated. It was a very difficult stage in early 2020, where we have to approach ICMR and we had to approach different agencies for validation. We approached state government. So unfortunately, we couldn't be the first one. We were sixth one in the list. So, but we got license for singleplex and singleplex assay validated, and then subsequently approved by ICMR and BCGI, the CDSCO. And this subsequently we launched, but we could see the opportunity that it was typical lockdown environment everywhere, so we couldn't get through any of the raw material available. It was a very challenging time for every manufacturer, getting raw materials, and unfortunately everything is imported. We had to import primers and probes. We had to import plastic ware from Canada and China, and we had to import. We don't have a single manufacturer at the time to manufacture plastic, the polypropylene vials, the screw cap vials, wherein we supplied kits. Those were imported from Canada. And primer probes, there are only two in country, Eurogentech and Eurofins, but unfortunately, the lead time is more than a month. So getting into that was a very big challenge for us. And then we started working on making all indigenization of all the stuff what is required, right from plastics. So we established a plastic unit. We started with plastics. We made an ISO 8 facility for plastics, and we made plastics. And since we were totally unaware of how the plastics are made, so we went around and found out an engineer suitable to partner with us to make plastics in this line. So we then set up the whole facility in 15 days, got second-hand injection mold machines, and then subsequently started making clean room assays. Within a month's time, we could make the plastics. And then subsequently, we made, when we started making plastics, then we went ahead and made RNA extraction columns. Unfortunately, all RNA column-based extraction was very expensive to do any experiments. So it was around 250 by Gaijin and around 150 rupees for Roche nucleic acid extraction column. So we then went ahead and worked with a couple of agencies, right from MDI, to get this column-based thing, and then subsequently we made plastics for it. and we got membrane from MDI, and then we made in the same clean room facility, we made nucleic acid extraction, and which became, the cheapest in the market. We got ICMR approval for that. And subsequently, every stage we had an issue in importing those. And then thankfully, some project is supported by BIRAC as well. And the major issue was in importing primers and probes. So getting to it, and since we were making enzyme, we were making plastics, now getting primers and probes was delaying quite a bit to supply the market. So again, we approached National Biopharma Mission BIRAC. So they have actually given a good grant to establish a facility, and we established a primer and probe facility, and currently we manufacture all the probes in country, like including Sci-5, Sci-3, all the probes which were manufactured in the country. So the objective was to indigenize everything, because the cost of the test was coming from 1,200, and the current cost of an RT-PCR, what we supplied the latest, is 23 rupees, which includes GST. So the tests have become, still we make margins. Not to the extent, but at least still we make margin on. So this is the real power of indigenization, the real power that you can make in country, and to show up to the world that we can make best quality products in the country. And thanks to IndieX and CCMB, where we had initial lots of evaluation done at both the centers. IndieX, we have validated all other enzyme mixers and put it on their platform. And right now, all the reagents are on the platform. And we have been selling, currently we actually have supplied more than 2.5 crores of tests across the country. And fortunately, we could employ, we started with 12 people, 13 people in 2018 and 19. So now we are 65. So we actually, that actually gave us a big boost to improve the manpower recruitment into the company. And also it improves the financials of the company. So right now we have done very decent turnover to the past 2 years. So we have done exceptionally well, and we have started building an FDA compliant facility. And right now we have started 2 more things. One, a chemistry company, which is into pharma, which is now we have started making small quantity of amyloids, as well as the reagents which are required for oligosynthesis, ancillary reagents for oligosynthesis. And apart from that, we are working on different novel assays, which currently we are working on receptor protein binding assays, where we can detect the virus in 10 seconds. So that probably we will launch by the end of this month. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and feel proud to be part of the elite panel.
Yeah, thank you, Shishir, for actually taking us through your journey, where all these challenges, that you faced, and at the same time you could able to do well by having all these, especially getting the things imported, and having them to develop a kit, or maybe whatever the versions of kits that you developed at Huvel, along with your co-founder, Dr. Rachna. So this journey really inspires many of the people, how you can actually work out indigenously to develop such successful kits, which are really spread to the global markets as well. So thank you so much, and I request all the panel members to turn on their video cameras, so that maybe quickly 4 or 5 questions. I think I have seen Dr. Shahid already answered some of the questions in the chat box, appreciating on that. But specific questions are directed to Dr. Jacob and Lalit and all. So maybe I'll take a few of the questions from the chat box. Actually, one of the participants, Mr. Gautam Krishnan, asking several of these questions. He's a freelance content writer. So maybe picking few of the questions in the chat box. So I think based on the experience, about 24 variants of SARS-CoV-2, out of them, 3 have been noticeable variants which are relevant to our 3 COVID waves. Okay, so should we be helpful with the fact that the present and potential vaccines that are here with us would control this pandemic? So current vaccines can actually be effective for other variants also. That's what the question. Shahid.
Well, so I mean, the question is whether vaccines will control this pandemic. Is that the question?
Variants.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I
So
mean,
variants, out of 24, 3 have been, identified.
There is no doubt. I have no doubt that this is a historical moment. This is the first time in human history that a vaccine will control a pandemic. Never happened, and this will become the norm. I have no doubts about it.
Great, thank you. I think Dr. Jacob, there is a question. See, when you mentioned about different models and statistics, and there are certain, COVID is a trigger, for example, for sole cause of death or any other comorbidities. So, will you be able to tell, whether the COVID virus or other factors that are relevant to this particular aspect? Can you please comment on that?
Is it addressed to me?
Yes, Dr. Jacob. I'll repeat the question actually. So, is there a kind of relationship established between the virus and the deaths? Okay, so can this be done even post-pandemic based on these studies? And also, you have any stats in your hand?
I think I'll paraphrase it a little bit and ask as to why are these comorbidities important for this particular infection, unlike so many other infections. HIV produces comorbidities, whereas here comorbidities make COVID worse and causes death. I think the secret lies in the receptor for the virus. This is Srinath Reddy's area, ACE2. It is necessary to control both blood pressure or modulate it and to supply blood to the extreme ends of tissues and organs. Therefore, ACE2 is so widely prevalent in the body, and comorbidities also have some effect of the ACE2, and that is the common factor that makes comorbidities actually make COVID worse and pushes them towards death. Possibly, we know that there is immune senility. That is, as you grow older, your immune robustness and alertness comes down, and it's a new infection, new antigen. It's not a memory drawing antigen. And if you look at less women affected than men, immune system functions better in women than in men. People above 75, 80 have greater mortality. People above 75, 80 have far less effective immune system because of senility. Actually, it's a continuum. It starts from about 60, 65 onwards. So all these are such a complex, as Srinath Reddy himself said about it's a complex situation.
Yes.
Unfortunately, because the virus's receptor is ACE2, all these are tied up together, and it is not just one disease. It's a plethora of diseases. Yes. And The problem is because of the ACE2 involvement, after you recover from COVID, you will have comorbidities develop in you, the so-called comorbidities, diabetes, cardiac problems. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think Dr. Srinath, you would like to add anything on this?
No, I think the explanation is perfect. Dr. Jacob John has very clearly explained. I think because the virus has hooked onto a receptor which is widely present in the body, it has a very clear opportunity to enter. And as Dr. John said, women seem to be slightly better protected for two reasons. First is evolutionary protection, where there is a premium placed on women's health and immunity because they are required for the propagation of the species. And secondly, the testes in the males also have a very high density of ACE2 receptors. So I think men are a little more prone to more severe infection because of the additional ACE2 reservoir. But nevertheless, I think Dr. John's explanation is absolutely right. It is the virus propensity for attacking the ACE2 receptor which makes it such a widespread disease-causing agent.
Oh, great, thank you. I mean, following on to that, when you are talking about the complex models need to be adapted, when you're trying to understand these virus and its spread, etc. I think one question is for you, Dr. Srinath. These complex adaptive systems or models that you mentioned, is it only the systems biology approach or any other approaches are there? That's what one of the participants is asking.
Not only systems biology, even the health system is a very complex one. The supply chains are complex. Whether people wear masks or not is also a complex area of behavior. So there are multiple complex systems which are interacting. In fact, I would like to recommend a very nice article in a journal called Safety Science. These people are dealing only with safety issues, industrial safety and others, but they've applied the complexity thinking to COVID pandemic, and it's a very nice article by Tarcio Abru-Sorin in Safety Science, November 2020. I think it's a very nice article that should be read by everybody, particularly those interested in COVID.
That's wonderful information. Maybe one question for Lalit or Dr. Rakesh can actually answer. This is a basic question, the variants that have arisen like the Delta, do they require separate set of primers? I think basic science question probably. Is there a proportion of alpha, delta and kappa? Can it be quantified using RT-PCR or multiplex PCR? Are we sequencing enough clinical samples? Please highlight on this aspect, maybe quickly.
I mean, before Dr. Rakesh takes it on from a science perspective, one of the things is that almost all of the diagnostics manufacturers in our cohort are following a very strict regimen of checking their primers and probes, the sequences, both in silico and in a large number of cases, even Hewell, Shishir is here and will kind of confirm to that in clinical samples. A. B, from the presentation that Dr. Mishra made, it's very clear that having specifically targeted kits that only look for the Delta plus variant, which seemed like a fantastic idea about 40 days ago, doesn't seem relevant anymore, given the fact that almost everything is Delta or Delta plus. I mean, in fact, on the day that the government was announcing that there were only 40 Delta plus cases, I think we were a few thousands of cases more, honestly. So those specifically targeted variant kits are not needed. But be rest assured that every one of the manufacturers, at least within the indigenous cohort that we talk to, are both